Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. We're always on Galaxy 19 satellite and muslimnetwork.tv. Also on Amazon Fire TV, Roku, as well as a whole lot of social media. And pretty soon we are going to be on Apple TV as well. Thank you so much for joining us at the Mujahid Talk. We're supporting a campaign which is called June2020.org. It's a campaign for poor people. I was startled to learn on their website that 10 million people are without housing. That was not much startling, but the fact that 18 million vacant houses are there in the country. So we're at the brink of huge homelessness. And I think now that 20 million people are jobless, that risk and danger has increased substantially. But there are vacant houses. How is the system that there are people who are out while there is a space available? And that probably doesn't count whole large scale buildings who are occupied for a few hours a day and rest of the time they remain vacant. In USA today, 52% of children under the age of 18 are poor or low income. You know how many that is? That is 38.5 million children. And when more than half of our children do not know if they will have a place to sleep or something to eat, and whether they have a safe communities or not, we're failing families and compromising the future of our country. It does not need to be this way, especially not in the richest country in the world. It does not need to be that way. We have abundant resources. We have accumulated a lot of wealth. And myself and you are blessed with a whole lot of things. Even if we don't recognize the blessing of God Almighty, we are blessed people. So June 2020 organization estimates that child poverty costs more than $1 trillion per year in lost economic productivity, increased cost of healthcare, and crime cost, an increased cost of resulting from child homelessness and malnutrition. And in today's America, if these children are found jaywalking, yes, jaywalking while black. Just there was this news this morning that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a couple of kids were detained, and the camera shows that there is no sidewalk. So they're walking on the street and they're detained. When detention like that happen, what happens? Criminal justice system kicks in, where blacks are guilty without any presumption of innocence. And blacks don't expect much justice since they rarely get the jury of their peers. And that's how the poverty and criminal justice system is connected and disproportionately impact Black people and the poor people and non-whites, but some poor whites as well. To discuss with that is someone who has dedicated his life to be a minister. Please welcome Reverend Rob Stephens. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Rob Stephens serves as a minister for organizing at Middle Collegiate Church. Rob joined the pastoral team at Middle in the spring of 2016 after graduating from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York with a Master of Divinity. He has also participated in organizing for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Well, tell us, what is June 2020, except that we are in June 2020 in a year? Very clever name there.
Yes. We even have some chance, June 2020. So we are, it's around the summer solstice. And so the longest day of the year that we're choosing to shine a light on the issue of poverty and racism in this country. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, was relaunched almost 2.5 years ago on the 50th anniversary of the original Poor People's Campaign, which was launched by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King as his final campaign to bring people together across difference, from the white people in Appalachia to people, farm workers in the western part of the country, to indigenous people, to people from the Mississippi Delta, saying that this is a new and unsettling force that couldn't be beaten. And he was murdered in cold blood while he was building that campaign on a Memphis balcony, April 4th, 1968. So we've picked up that baton, but also know that
So it was the some workers. He went to support their strike. They're sanitation workers, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
And so sanitation worker at the time, were they all people, or they were exceptionally disproportionately Black who were involved in that?
In Memphis at that time, they were, and there was there wasn't any Black managers or people of any power. And so the spark for that was actually there was such poor working conditions that 2 men had been crushed in a trash machine, and so there was this march to demand more protections, better wages, and safer working conditions for people who were cleaning up the city of Memphis. And it became a spark in a place that everyone said don't go to Dr. King. He said it's too dangerous. It's too people might not empathize with poor people there. And he said, no, I have to go. And so we often remember that march and his prophetic mountaintop speech that he gave the night before he was killed, where he said he might not have a long life, but you want to live a life worth living, no matter how long it is. So that's where we find some inspiration, but we also find inspiration knowing that Dr. King didn't build that movement by himself. There was national welfare rights organizations, Black women who were building movements across the country that really gave substance to that movement, and people from across the country, farm workers, people from Appalachia, and so that's some of the inspiration. But now we have movements all over the country today that are also doing that work that we're building on. And I get to serve as National Political Director for Repairs of the Breach, which is one of the 2 anchor organizations for the Poor People's Campaign. We started out, we said, we have plenty of organizations. We don't need a new organization. What we need is a movement. And so the Poor People's Campaign itself is not an organization, but it's anchored by 2 different ones, one based at Union Theological Seminary, Kairos Center, and then Repairs of the Breach, which is led by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, who's one of our co-chairs alongside Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris at Kairos Institute.
So it connects with the Dr. King's campaign, but I remember, reading, of course I was not there, that when Dr. King came on this Poor People's Campaign to Chicago, he was beaten up. Was the campaign, civil rights campaign as one, but when he transitioned to Poor People's Campaign, I think to broaden his message and bring to the limelight what poor people are facing, did the support went down or it increased? I'm asking this question because one of the questions which I'm going to ask you is, what is the direction?
Mm-hmm. So in the last year of Dr. King's life, he became increasingly more disillusioned with reform and thinking that this system just needs a total restructuring. And the major thing is that a year to the date of his death, April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, he gave the famous speech called about the war in Vietnam. And he says, when silence is betrayal. And he came out against the war. And every national civil rights organization, of course, every white conservative organization was already against him. But even the mainstream civil rights organizations said you shouldn't be focusing on war. You only need to be doing civil rights. But he was expanding this conversation, saying that he talked about the triple evils of racism. He called it materialism, but in poverty, which I think is important that he had that materialism connected to poverty. And then militarism. So those 3. We've added 2 to them: ecological devastation, and I've
Before
been.
you move, isn't this important to note that exactly 1 year after that speech, he was murdered? Am I correct?
Exactly 1 year. Yeah, and yes, it is. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that it happened that way. I mean, he knew his life was threatened at that point, both from the federal government. He was getting all sorts of harassment from the FBI. There's lots of unanswered questions in his actual death and who was responsible for him, if it's one person or a conspiracy. But I think what's important, what he said about another death, is that it's not necessarily who killed him, the individual, but what killed him. And what killed him was the fear of this movement of people coming together and realizing that so many people are being brought down for the greed of a few.
So when this the fresh movement, which you're spokesperson for at this moment, or one of the organizers, you connect with that in hope that you will be able to build a broader coalition. Why do you connect with that movement, which was ended with his life at that time?
Yeah, so I think I'm from North Carolina, where Reverend Barber's from, and I started here in what we called the Moral Mondays movement, which was really a state-based movement. And what we looked around, and he looked around in the 2000s, in 2007, 2008, and said, all these different groups, the environmental justice groups, the anti-death penalty groups, the criminal justice groups, the healthcare justice, education justice, all these different groups that are fighting for things. It's the same people who are fighting against us on them. And he says, if they're cynical to be enough to be together, then we should be smart enough to come together. That if it's the same people who are blocking voting rights, or blocking education, or blocking protections for equal protection under the law for all people, then we need to come together as well. And so that's the reason that that a siloed movement, we think that a single issue movement is limited in how much traction we can get. That we have to move from what has been transactional politics, which is you do this for me, I'll do this for you, I'll show up for you for this, to transformational politics, saying that we're not going to leave even when we get our victory. So if we get one victory, in criminal justice, that the criminal justice advocates aren't going to go away. They're going to stick with us until we get housing. Because we know that all those things are interconnected, as you brilliantly put together with the criminal justice system and poverty. That these are interconnected systems. And that's why we call them interlocking injustices that we're dealing with now.
So you had this thought that if we bring all these issues together, it will be good to build the movement, and it will be a different type of politics, or a transformational politics, you call it.
Mm-hmm.
A good theory, but are you achieving result on that basis? Because I still see people are campaigning in different silos. Women's movement was separate, and the Black Lives Matter campaign is a separate one, and the climate change one is a separate one. And here you are with a great theory, but trust me, I mean, I could be wrong, but in Chicago, not many people know about your campaign. I mean, I had several interfaith leaders, community leaders, Muslim, Latino leaders, and when somebody mentioned this, I asked around. People don't know much about it. So while you have a good theory, are you being drowned by people who are singular agenda, are more successful in taking their cause forward?
Well, I think we live in an interesting time today where breaking through the narrative can be difficult. We're seeing a lot of breakthroughs, and certainly through CNN in the past couple of weeks. The media attention. If you just Google it, it's being saturated in the media right now with Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz talking about the Poor People's Campaign. And so we've seen lots of success. We are focused on local movements, and by definition, that's going to be different in different places across the country. And so our goal is not always being the most popular, but that we're digging down into these local states. So we have 46 state coordinating committees, in campaigns that are really focusing on local pieces, but also coming together for this national narrative. But we are seeing, movement in many different ways. And as far as people, calling on Bishop Barber and the campaign to weigh in on these, just last night, Bishop Barber was on the Oprah special that went over to millions of viewers across all of Discovery Channel, talking about this campaign, and it was the call to action at the end, and we saw a huge bump in our online. So we're not saying, we think that it's the approach that's needed. It's not the easiest way to do it. There are easier ways to build a movement, but they won't last as long, is what we think. So that this is hard work and it takes time and relationship building. But we think it's the stuff that has the texture to what one of our leaders says, stick and stay. So we're seeing a lot. We know that we have a kind of dissected attention span here in the United States and across the country. So it is a constant effort, but we're seeing certainly results in the awareness of what we're doing everywhere.
Well, thank you so much. This is Malik Mujahid, and we're talking with Reverend Rob Stephens, who is representing a national call for moral revival, Poor People's Campaign, and you're watching Muslim Network TV, and we'll be right back after these messages.
We are the 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, building the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
On June 20th, we will rise together for the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, a digital justice gathering.
On June 20th, we will come together to lift the voices and faces of poverty in the midst of pandemic.
Rise with us. Visit June2020.org.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Reverend Rob Stephens, who is speaking for Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And there is going to be a major moment on June 20th, 2020. And I'm going to be personally part of it, and you can all watch it 10 a.m. Eastern Time to 12:30 on Muslim Network TV live broadcast. Tell us, who are the poor people in America? I mean, who are the poor people? I mean, they are all around. I mean, in New York, it is said that 1 in 4 person is looking for food in the current situation. Poverty definitely seems to have increased recent time, but give me a demographic of poor, what poor look like.
That's an excellent question, and one of our main parts of our movement is that we historically, if it's all right, if I just kind of based on historically how we've defined poverty in the United States, is a very political decision. And that so sometimes we even fought with people. We are militantly nonpartisan. So we go after Democrats, Republicans, anyone saying that we need poverty and racism to be at the center. But we even struggled with people who talk about poverty being 40 million people in the United States. But that's using an incredibly stingy view of what poverty is. So with that understanding, if you make $13,000 a year as an individual in the United States, you're not considered poor to the federal government and under that. Even if you're living in New York City, in Chicago, in LA. If you're a family of 4 making $26,000 a year, you're not considered poor with 4 people in your family. And so, and we know that you can in the United States, and there's actually no place in the United States that you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment with minimum wage and with that type of income. And so we are, if you read some of the statistics that our academics and researchers did to look at an expanded view of poverty that says that we actually have 140 million people. Now that 100 million between the 40 million who are called poverty by the federal poverty level, the FPL, and that 100 million, those 100 million are one emergency away from being in severe poverty. And so one $500 emergency that they couldn't afford that would send them into poverty. And actually that 100 million, often they just flow back and forth between, being just above water back into drowning and being.
I think is so much, just this particular thing, just $500 will throw them off. Recently I saw, I think in New York Times, or was it Washington Post, I forgot, a story about a family who, after several years of a struggle, was able to get out and have a rented house. And then suddenly, because of the situation, they lost everything. Now they're in car.
Right. Yeah, I saw that article.
Unable to get out of their car, and you have to use facilities and cannot take shower. And I was reading that. I had difficulty. They have a car, but that's all they have.
Mm-hmm.
They have sometimes no money to feed their kids who are in the car.
Yeah.
And so that $500 tipping point seems to be very serious. Can you take a little more? What 500? Say they ended up in hospital?
Yeah, I mean, if you ended up in the hospital, any sort of insurance that isn't covered in a natural disaster, something like someone gets sick is the main. So I think the number one way that someone falls into poverty is through a health crisis. And that has to do with the fact that we're the only, of the top 25 GDPs in the country, we're the only in the world, we're the only country that ties insurance to a job instead of to someone's humanity. That that as a human being you deserve health care, which is the rest of the world that is in the tier of our economies has figured out that you deserve health care, and that actually we spend far more than any other country on health care, even though we don't provide it to everyone.
So it goes into different systems which we have of the corporate insurance and this and that. So money goes into the system, so make the budget bigger of what we spend on that healthcare, except that the poor people went a little bit here and there, and they're just gone.
Yeah,
so please continue. So $500 can turn somebody off. I mean, there are people who probably don't have even that type of a money. So do people define poor people, say, with different, how would you define, if you have control of defining who is the poor in our country, richest country in the world, how would you define poverty?
So there's certainly, analytical numbers. And so we define the 140 million based on 200% of the federal poverty level being that. And there's actually a longer explanation. And I'm not an economist, so I'll refer that to the website to really break down how you get to that number. But we know that this is happening everywhere. I mean, that's the importance of June 20 is to get these stories out, that people are really struggling in the United States, and it's not coming to the fore. And what's interesting to your question, to your point earlier, is actually while Black people in the United States 61% of Black people in the United States are poor or low income, but the largest group of poor people in the United States are actually white people. That white people
or number-wise?
Numerically, so numbers-wise. So we have more poor white people than any other group. And so, but we have a narrative of racism in the country that poor people are all Black or brown or Native American, but actually the groups that are taking the most from public services, that are on social services, getting sustenance and payments out, are white people. But we have a narrative that was created by post civil rights to vilify poor Black people, especially the welfare mother, the welfare queen, saying that they're the ones who are sucking from our safety net. They're the ones who are depending on the state. When it's actually white people who are hurt the most when we cut social services.
So
So that's part of the counterintuitive piece of this campaign, is to say, you think that poverty is about Black and brown people, but that's been part of the trick that the nation and the leaders have done, is to try to make that so you don't care about this issue that's affecting so many people in the United States.
So, what would you say proportionately speaking? I mean, if 60% of Blacks are proportionally who are impacted by poverty, what percentage of white people are impacted by poverty? So,
on some level, I think we're all impacted by poverty right now, and I'll leave that for another point. And I think COVID-19 has really shown us that. But on percentage level, we have it's 26 million Black people, so that's 61% of the population, of Black population. It's 64% of Latino people, that's 38 million people. It's 40% of Asians, that's 8 million people. It's 58% of Native and Indigenous people, that's 2 million people. And it's 33% of white people, which is 66 million people. So that's where so it's actually 40 million more poor white people than poor Black people in the United States.
But tell me this, I'd like to, understand it a little better. Why then white poor or white uneducated are disproportionately support politics, which might hurt them?
Yeah, so there's a long history of how white, we know that race is not real. Race is a social construct, there's no biological basis for it. So we know that there's a story behind it.
I'm glad you're mentioning that, because in Islamic terminology, there is no word which compared to the word race. I mean, God Almighty tells people all people are the same from Adam and Eve. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, preached no superiority of Black over white or white over Black and all that. But I was looking for what is the word which can, define, as we discuss race, and I couldn't find one. Mm-hmm. So the race construct, as you're challenging, I can provide you some theological basis of questioning that as well. So please continue. I interrupted you.
Oh, no. Yeah, I'd love to hear more of that. I also serve as a Racial Equity Institute doing trainings in this area. And then we talk about it all the time in the Poor People's Campaign. We start with racism. Mm-hmm. And what we know is very important to remember is that racism is the father of race. Race is the child of racism, not the other way around. So we get confused in thinking that there's somehow races before, and then race and then prejudice came on top of it, and we created racism. But no, racism created race. So 400 years ago is when there wasn't white people. I often joke, people say that Columbus was the first white person to arrive in North America, and that's wrong, because in 1492 we had not invented white people. It is an invented group, and so we know that on one level very made up, but also, is it real? Yes, it's the most powerful predictor of outcomes in our country.
But also at this moment, I mean, in this particular thing, that race is nothing could be used against those people who are articulating, for example, Black Lives Matter. That whole argument someone can dismiss based on that, well, race doesn't exist, because there are people who are impacted by racism.
Absolutely.
And for them, articulating on that basis is a very legitimate way of projecting.
And so I'm a dialectical thinker. So when I say, is race real or completely made up? The answer is yes, it is. It's very real. It is the most powerful predictor of outcomes in our country. Me as a white person, where I live, where I went to school, how I'm treated when I go to the doctor, how I'm treated when I interact with the police, is predicted by this thing that has been put on me by society, which is whiteness. And so it's very real, but it's important to know that it's not really real because humans made it. Because if humans made it, then we can also unmake it. And so that's why it's important to go back to racism. That racism isn't what we're going after racism. And the idea that some groups, there's something wrong with some groups and there's something better about other groups. And what's really interesting about poor white people is that actually, if you look at the book Merged Left by Ian Haney Lopez, he cites a exit study from 2016 that he broke down white voters based on who made $30,000 and less, those who made between $30,000 and $70,000, and those who made over $70,000. And the group that was the least likely to vote for President Trump was actually the group that made less than $30,000, the least likely. Now, that's not how a lot of news media and other,
even among the white poor.
No, that's white people.
Ah,
White people only pulled out. So we have a narrative, and this is convenient for middle class, ruling class white people, is to say, oh, racism is really about those poor white people who are being mean to black people. But really, we think that systemic racism is a system. It's not an individual act. And actually, to say systemic racism is somewhat redundant, because racism is systemic. It's a part of it's in every institution in our country. And what we find is that actually, that if we, working with poor white people in East Kentucky, coal miners working across the country, and if you look at some of our videos and testimonies on the website that we put one out each day, you'll see some of these folks, and fast food workers who, once you start working with them, they really get engaged and have a lot of success working across difference. Sometimes even, much more than we do with people who, the kind of wealthier people who have some hangups on working with poor people. So it's, that's part of the counterintuitive nature of what we're trying to do with the Poor People's Campaign.
so would you say that Poor People's Campaign now is more successful in engaging non-Black poor as compared to, say, Dr. King's campaign, which, shortened by his blatant murder?
Well, I try to keep humility, especially because I have some elders in my life who were part of that campaign. And so I won't say that we're outdoing them, because they were in a different time and working under different circumstances. We have people who work with us now who had their house dynamited during that campaign in East Kentucky, people who lost friends who were shot in front of them by Ku Klux Klan members. So as far as success, it's hard to, historical kind of comparing history is difficult. I think we're learning and building on what movements did before us. And if we don't, then we're doing them a disservice. And we're trying our best to both be, loyal to their legacy, but also learning from their mistakes and trying to hold something together. Because we know that movements fall apart in the history of the United States. Have always, this fissure of racism is usually what cracks through movements and separates people. And that's how, the ruling class often uses it to break down movements.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. We're always on Galaxy 19 satellite and muslimnetwork.tv, as well as Amazon Fire and Roku and a whole lot of other places. Pretty soon we'll be on Apple TV as well. And this is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with our amazing guest who is trying to organize poor people and across the ethnic line, and Reverend Rob Stephens. And we'll be right back after these messages.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to $210 million. Two of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, a slow-burning genocide, on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tel Aviv Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast From China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
We are the 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, building the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
On June 20th, we will rise together for the mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, a digital justice gathering.
On June 20th, we will come together to lift the voices and faces of poverty in the midst of pandemic.
Rise with us. Visit June2020.org.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Reverend Rob Stephens, and you're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19, as well as Amazon Fire TV and other places. We're talking about poverty, but at the same time, what you can do about that. And June 20th, 2020, there's going to be a digital rally of all the people, poor people, talking about what is it for them. And it is a major mobilization, including Oprah Winfrey last night was with one of the leaders of this campaign. And you'll be able to watch that live on June 20th, right here on Muslim Network TV. And I look forward to you joining. I will definitely be there listening and learning. But while we're talking with Reverend Rob Stephens, who is representing the Poor People's Campaign, one of the thing which is, it may take me a minute to define that. You know, anytime you talk about systemic change, question comes in, our system is based on capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Are you trying to demolish capitalism? Are you a socialist? Or as Dr. King was suspected openly of being a communist, or trying to destroy the good capitalism which we have going for us. And with the polarization in the society, and America going hard on a communist country, China, which is hardly a communist country to me. I mean, it's a totalitarian capitalist country as far as I'm concerned, with the cover of the political system, which is of Communist Party. So if your campaign strengthens, would you expect to be accused of anti-capitalist, pro-communist? Are you a communist yourself?
No, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a communist. We certainly expect to be called that. I mean, and people who I would consider the most rabid capitalists are accused of being communists by some people in the country today. So it's it's not it's a duality and by a dichotomy that is unhelpful. I think what we would say is that that capitalism and racism were born together, especially in this country, and that you can't separate how racism was created and how capitalism. And so when we get asked, oftentimes people ask, is it race or is it class that we should be dealing with? And again, our answer would be yes, it is. That you can't look at capitalism as it has been formed in this country, and not understand how racism created it. That racism was a part of creating the wealth on the backs of enslaved free labor here in this country, and poor, and which also helped was a strategy to keep poor white people no wages. And so we're going to be strong critics of the current economic system. Now, I'm not I think what should I say? I'm open-minded in my criticism. I'll critique any system, because we know that communism doesn't necessarily get rid of racism. Socially, you can go to Cuba and other places that have racism still is there, and certainly Russia and other places. And it's not and capitalism is not tied to democracy, which you just mentioned with China. They're very capitalistic, getting a lot of economy going. But what we're saying is that we need an economic system that breaks out of these old divides, that actually serves the masses of people. That we have enough. That United States is the richest country in the world, but it's actually the richest country in the history of the planet. And so we think that you have to. There's no reason that we can't provide these basic things for every single person. We don't want to get caught up in whether that's socialist or capitalist. Because from a faith perspective, we say it's Christian, or it's being part of our deepest moral faith traditions of whether it's Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or even some agnostic. But that's actually where our deeper and that's actually constitutional too. So Dr. King was one of, and Frederick Douglass was one too, who held these two things together. That held our deepest religious values in one hand, and held the Constitution in the other, and said that these two things provide for the general welfare of our country, and that there's enough right here that we can base a society on where everyone has enough and everyone can live free of fear and free of want.
You mentioned, when you were mentioning the poor in this country, I was surprised to hear that, if I remember correctly, that 40% of the, among Asian, there is a 40% poverty. Asian are held up as a good, well-to-do community, educated and all that, and Silicon Valley and so on and so forth. Could we dwell on that? Because some of our listeners are Asians, and I don't see anybody talking about poverty except some couple of crazy people like myself. I mean,
you're in good company. It's true, and Asian poverty is one of those things that is hidden, and so and it's obviously just like white and black and Latino, the category Asian involves countless numbers of different groups of people and is an arbitrary construct of grouping people together. But Asian poverty is a serious issue, especially when you go to places like New York and the big cities. But it can be very hidden, and it can be very different based on the history of our immigration policies, of when we've let groups in and under what circumstances. And so I think I heard the other day that over 50%.
That is so true. I mean, sorry to cut you off, but in New York, there were disproportionate number of among blacks and Latinos were Asians, Bangladeshis. And one of them told me, very early stages, there are 200 or 300 people who have died in that communities because they were living in a concentrated areas in poor conditions and poor health facility. One of them says that that whose son died, that we tried to get 2-3 times, and they said no, only when he has difficulty breathing come in. And he said we tried, and then finally when they allowed him to come, a 30-year-old young Bangladeshi American, he couldn't live more than a day. Just because, and that's the time when different celebrities were announcing, I tested negative, and nobody was testing these people. So you pointed out that, based on immigrant and how they are coming, they may be subject to that. Please continue. Sorry for interruption.
No, absolutely. And that's a story that is shared in so many groups of people who wanted to get tested and couldn't. And that goes to the failure of our healthcare system, which is built to make money and not to serve people. I recently went through it myself. Me and my wife had our first child 2 months ago, and just watching how thank you, it's a great joy. But it was in the middle of this crisis, this quarantine, and just watching how our system is made up of fine people, great nurses and doctors, many of them, but the system is set up for making money and not for serving the health of people. What's interesting, what we really want to do in the Poor People's Campaign is bringing in all these groups, because as people immigrate to this country, what we have is a race-based system since 400 years. 400 years ago, our Constitution, our first census had white and black, slave and free. And as people come in, you don't come in independent of white and black. We call white in the Racial Equity Institute, white and black are the bookends of the racial arrangement. And what bookends do is they hold it up together. And so there's an anti-black bias that is tried to put on people as they come into this country, saying you can be like anyone, but don't be like black people. And so that we often see even immigrants who are coming from predominantly black countries, when in the culture that we live in, there's this anti-blackness that will be pushed, saying, that there's this group of people in the United States who they've had all these opportunities and they've wasted them, and you don't want to be like them. You want to be like the good people who work hard and make it up, without looking at the history of how structures have been set up to keep people in a certain racial arrangement. So I think it's important to really dig in and see where is poverty, and we see it in even in Muslim communities and where I'm from in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where there can be different groups of people who are really struggling with poverty, and especially now, it's going to impact everyone. And the coronavirus, let's say this, Bishop Barber is very strong, and I think he said by itself the coronavirus is a puny germ. I mean, a bar of soap can kill it. What gives us its strength is the inequality in our country. It has strength and power to do the devastation it's done because of the inequities that we have in the United States, because of racism and poverty. That's what's actually given it the power to spread so widely and to be such a force to really shut down the country like nothing else in our memory. And so, we have to deal with these structural inequalities if we're ever going to, be able to resist, live through these types of pandemics and crises.
And tell us this: what people should expect on June 20th when they start watching? I mean, I wish people could participate in person. I think last year you have in person, right, in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, so last year we had a major Congress of 1,000 people in DC, which was powerful. There's the largest presidential, the first one of all the major presidential candidates in the Democratic primary. We invite Republicans. The year before that is when we actually had the 40 days of action. We had mass mobilizations in states across the country, and we had over 5,000 people that committed civil disobedience and got arrested. We had tens, hundreds of thousands of people who came out to marches. So we were disappointed. We wanted to be in DC for this mass poor people's assembly and moral march on Washington. We wanted to lift up the voices of those who most impacted. But we realize now that to keep people safe and also to really get the message out, we have to do it online. And so on June 20, what you can expect to see is you're going to hear the stories of people most impacted by the interlocking injustices: systemic racism, poverty, militarism in the war economy, in this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism and ecological devastation. And you're going to see their voices are going to be front and center. There'll be celebrities, there'll be other people who will introduce them, but they're all coming saying, we need to stop and listen to how people are being impacted by these interlocking injustices. And so you'll hear some heartbreaking stories, but you also hear the plans for how we change it and the demands that we have for changing this, and how people are organizing and coming together across all sorts of difference to demand a difference and to build power. We know that this is about building power. And so that's what we can expect on Saturday morning. We're really thrilled that the Muslim Network TV will be a part of it, and that y'all are going to be streaming it. And I think everyone will be excited. The main thing we want right now is for folks to go to june2020.org and to sign up and to pledge to be there, and then to share it with your networks so that we can all be there.
Tell me, it's also a presidential election, and candidates are coming up with their manifestos, and Carolinas have given a substantial push to Democratic Party potential nominee, presumptive nominee, I think they call them.
Yeah.
How do you see his platform as compared to President Trump's platform when it comes to poverty? I mean, I want to also put in that about 10% of Blacks and almost 9-10% of Muslims have supported Trump as well in the elections.
I think his press secretary said 8% the other day, and she was proud of that fact, which was surprising that 8% of African Americans voted for Trump. And we know, I mean, no group is monolithic, right? All groups have diversity. There's no one way to be Black. There's no one way to be Muslim. There's no one way to be Christian. So we know that groups are diverse and have lots of different expressions of it, and that's all right. But what we're concerned with is the policy. We think that the President Trump's policy campaign is based in fear and racism in this distorted moral narrative. I mean, it's no coincidence that he's going to have his first campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the place where Black Wall Street was, which was bombed. It's one of the few times in history where a community was literally bombed by white supremacists, and whole blocks burned and hundreds of people killed at that time. But it's also not the first time a presidential candidate has launched a campaign on the site of racial terror. Because we know in 1980, Ronald Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where those three young men, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were murdered by the Klan along with the sheriffs in the 1960s, who were part of the Civil Rights Movement. And he went there to announce his campaign in Neshoba County with a nod towards this virus of racism that has infected our country, and a nod towards trying to get white people to be afraid of change and afraid of a new America where the demographics are changing. So we know, but at the same time, we're not going to be satisfied with just going back to normal. We don't want to go back to normal. We don't want to go back to what we had before 2016, because before 2016, we had deep racism and poverty across this country. So we're not going to be satisfied with the status quo. We say, no back to normal. We need a new.
When you say status quo, do you mean the status quo of Democratic Party?
Oh, absolutely. We challenge what we say is that Republicans racialize poverty and Democrats run away from poverty. Democrats will talk about the middle class and the working class, but they will never go towards saying, actually, well, what about poor people? and not poor people who are just they're not poor because they're lazy. It's not because they're not working. They're people who are working really hard and not able to survive in this country. So we will challenge the status quo in the Democratic Party as well.
So on June 20th, this year, when you will be able to watch it on Muslim Network TV as well, do you think there are going to be some learning that how people can influence the congressperson and senators and local politicians who control our money and our taxes? Will people be able to learn how to have tools to have impact in support of poor people?
Absolutely, absolutely. So on that day, there'll be a major ask is working through the demands that we've developed over the past few years, working with poor communities to write these demands that will be the ability will be asking people to send those demands to their congresspeople and to use those demands as they're thinking about this problem. There'll be other opportunities, a lot of actions that you can take on that site to get plugged into local state coordinating committees, and so local poor people's campaigns to be a part of the work on a more local level. And if you go to Poor People's Campaign right now, there's a Take Action tab. So there's already places that people who are really invested want to take. So there's going to be options for people to take different levels of action, how much time they can spend that day. But yeah, there's going to be no limit to how much. We want everyone to come in. Everyone's welcome, and there's plenty of work to do and plenty of shared struggle to be a part of.
So, who funds your campaign? Last question.
Yeah, that might be above my pay grade a little bit. So we have certainly individual donors, and so you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org and donate. We really appreciate that being a large part of it, and then other foundations and so forth. One thing that we're very serious about, and one thing that has probably limited us in the past, is that we don't do very well with restrictions on our funding. And so early on, we often would have people say, well, we'll give you funding as long as you don't talk about this, or as long as you kind of be quiet about this and focus on this issue. And so very early on, we said, we're not doing that. We don't take strings attached. Our accountability is to the people, and to the 140 million poor and low income people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I've been talking with the Reverend Rob Stephens, who is a minister and an organizer for Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The richest country in the history had lots of poor people. That these poor people need to connect with each other to make our country a better country. And you can always watch Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Amazon Fire TV, Roku, on our website, muslimnetwork.tv, YouTube and Facebook pretty soon on Apple TV as well. So thank you, Reverend, and thank you, our great intern producer, Sumaya Haider, who is producing today's show, and our producer, Zahra Nadeem, and supervising producer, Connor Mays. Thank you, peace, and salam.